The corridor hummed like a cold beehive, and Mark said, "Tell me she's stable." Dr. Patel met his eyes, then looked past him, and Elena said, "Mom." The monitor sighed, a long flat whisper, and the room forgot how to breathe. Dr. Patel said, "I'm sorry, there's nothing more we can do." Elena folded as if a string were cut, and Mark caught her elbow, whispering, "I've got you." She shook, a storm trapped in a body, and said, "She promised she'd fight." The sheet rose over a still face, and Mark's chest burned with useless prayers. He said, "Lean on me," but the words felt made of paper. His mind flashed to sunlight and laughter, and a ring he never bought. He thought, if love means holding on, why does it feel like letting go already? The night folded into a gray morning, and Mark said, "Let me call Noah." Elena stared at the vending machine, as if it were a door to before. She said, "I should have been here earlier." He said, "You were here every day." She pressed the cold can to her cheek like a fever charm. Dr. Patel said, "Grief scrambles time. Be gentle with yourselves." Mark nodded, but guilt gnawed like a dull saw. He said, "I'll handle the paperwork," and the words tasted like dust. Elena said she wanted me to open the letter. He knew the letter held a future that would rip them both. He said, "When you're ready," and wished readiness could save anyone. The envelope trembled in Elena's hands, and she said, "It came yesterday." Mark watched her thumb worry the seal, and he said, "You don't have to." She said, "She wanted me to know today." The flap tore like a quiet verdict. He remembered last week's kitchen laughter, stew simmering, promises thin as steam. She read, "Seattle Fellowship, full ride," and her voice broke on the last word. He said, "She wanted this for you." The syllables scraped his throat raw. Elena closed her eyes as if seeing her mother's nod. He thought of maps of distance and love that survives by leaving. Noah arrived with bad coffee and good shoulders, and he said, "I'm here." Mark managed a crooked smile that felt borrowed. Elena said, "Seattle is 3,000 miles. Noah said, "It's also a door your mom kicked open." Mark heard the word door and saw it close on his chest. He said, "You should go," and the room tilted. Elena whispered, "What about us?" He touched her knuckles and said, "We won't make this decision inside a funeral." Noah looked away to give the moment air. Mark counted the beats until breathing almost made sense. The release papers scraped under a pen, and Mark said, "I'll drive you home." Elena said, "Home is about to feel different." He wanted to promise permanence, and knew it would be a lie. Dr. Patel said, "We'll call about arrangements," and his voice was a soft hand on a bruise. Outside, the rain thinned to mist, and Noah said, "Text me if you fade." Mark tucked the letter into Elena's bag and said, "One step at a time." She nodded, and the nod felt like a goodbye learning its shape. He thought, love means choosing what helps her heal, even if it breaks me. Mark sat on the porch where morning frost clung to the railing, and he said, "This silence feels like a weight." Elena sat across, clutching her mother's scarf, and said, "It still smells like her perfume." He wished he could bottle the air before grief diluted it. Noah stepped out with steaming mugs and said, "Drink, you'll freeze." Elena pressed her forehead to the cup, whispering, "She wanted me to be brave." Mark said, "You already are." The wind rattled chimes, sounding like broken prayers. Noah looked at Mark and said, "Don't carry all of this alone." Mark nodded, though his chest already knew solitude was his inheritance. The kitchen smelled of burnt toast, and Elena said, "She always hated when I cooked." Mark said, "She loved that you tried." He scraped black crumbs into the sink, and thought how effort never felt enough. Noah leaned on the counter and said, "Normal feels strange now." Elena smiled faintly and said, "Maybe we build new normal." Mark heard her mother's voice echoing that word and felt his throat close. He said, "We can start with breakfast that doesn't set off the smoke alarm." They laughed, brittle but alive. The laughter cracked Grief's surface just enough to let air in. Later, Mark stood in the backyard where the ground still held yesterday's rain, and he said, "Your mom planted these roses." Elena knelt to touch a bud, saying, "She said they bloom better after storms." Noah leaned on the fence and said, "Seems fitting." The air was sharp with earth and memory, and Mark felt the ache of roots and endings. Elena whispered, "She wanted me to chase light, not shadows." Mark said, "Then Seattle is light." She looked at him, eyes glistening, and said, "But leaving means leaving you." He swallowed hard, tasting metal, and thought, "Love sometimes means being the shadow." That evening, the three sat around the dining table, where the fourth chair stayed empty like a wound. Elena said she always carved the turkey, even when it wasn't Thanksgiving. Mark said, "She said any dinner was worth celebrating." Noah poured water, and his hand shook. Mark thought about the 1,000 rituals that make a family, and how fragile they become without one voice. Elena traced the wood grain with her finger and said, "I don't know if I can fill her space." Mark reached across and said, "You don't have to fill it. Just keep it alive." She nodded, tears sliding silently. Later, Mark walked Elena to her room, the door painted pale blue, edges chipped. She said, "It feels wrong to sleep while she's gone." He said, "Rest isn't betrayal." She clutched the scarf, her knuckles pale, and whispered, "She told me once I'd have to live for both of us someday." Mark said, "Maybe that day starts now." Her shoulders trembled, and he pulled the blanket over her like a fragile shield. She closed her eyes, whispering, "Stay a while." He sat in the chair, knowing he'd sit there as long as she needed, even if dawn never came. The funeral director slid a brochure across the table, while rain drummed the awning. Mark said, "We want simple, but dignified." Elena kept tracing a lily on the page, like it could answer a prayer. The director said, "Costs are listed here," and the numbers shouted. Mark said, "I can cover the deposit," and his stomach clenched. He texted his manager for overtime and watched the dots never appear. Elena whispered, "We can postpone the memorial." He said she hated delays, and the lie tasted small and heavy. Noah said, "I'll call the church," trying to sound bigger than worry. The rain thinned, and Mark imagined a cheaper sky. Elena said, "Seattle keeps calling." He said, "We'll answer after we bury her," and felt the deadline tick. The director slid a pen forward, and paper scratched like gravel. Mark said, "We'll find a way," and the room offered no evidence. The phone vibrated on the counter, until Elena picked it up like a hot coal. She said, "This is Elena," and her face tightened. The coordinator said, "Decision due in 72 hours. Mark said, "You earned it," and the words scraped him. She pressed speaker, and the room became small. The voice said, "Housing is reserved. Stipend starts next month." Noah said, "We can pack fast," but his eyes searched Mark. Mark said, "I'll handle boxes," and felt his job slip like soap. A text flashed from HR, and he read, "Budget cuts finalize Friday." Elena said, "We can defer," and hope flared, then dimmed. He said, "No, you go now," and the kitchen seemed to tilt. The call ended, leaving the clock to speak for everyone. Mark stared at the kettle's reflection and saw a goodbye reheating. The mail thudded like a verdict. Mark said, "I've got it," and carried the stack to the table. Elena opened an envelope and exhaled a strangled sound. She said, "Hospital balance due by the end of month." Noah rubbed his neck and said, "We can start a fund." Mark shook his head and said, "Too slow." He lifted the case from under the couch like a secret. Elena said, "Not the guitar," and her voice cracked. He said, "It's a thing you are not." The pawnshop bell later sounded like weak mercy. He returned with a thin receipt and a thinner smile. Elena touched the paper and whispered, "You love that sound." He said, "I love you more," and the room caught the truth and winced. The doorbell rang with the old chime Elena's mother never replaced. Elena opened to Richard Hale, and the past stepped across the threshold. He said, I came as soon as I heard, wearing a suit that never softened. Mark stood beside the coats and kept his jaw steady. Richard said, I can cover the funeral and the move to Seattle. He added, but you'll stay with me for a while and make things right. Elena said, right for whom? And her hands curled. Mark said, we're handling it, but money hung like bait. Richard said, opportunities require discipline, and glanced at Mark like a problem. Noah hovered in the hallway and said, she doesn't owe you a performance. Elena looked at the floor and whispered, I need time. Richard pressed a card into her palm and smiled like a contract. Mark felt the choice sharpening, a blade aimed at his own ribs. Night returned with the kind of quiet that edits thoughts. Mark sat on the back steps and said, he can fund everything. Noah lowered beside him and said, at a cost. Mark said, if she goes now, she launches clean. He added with me, it gets complicated and small. Noah said, you're not small, you're home. Mark stared at the fence and said, homes can become cages. He typed a message and deleted it until the screen felt bruised. Noah said, don't martyr yourself for style points. Mark said, she deserves flight, not ballast. The kitchen light clicked on, and Elena's silhouette paused. He pocketed the phone and whispered, I'll help her pack tomorrow. Noah said, and after, and Mark swallowed the word after, like glass. The attic smelled of cedar and dust. When Elena tugged at a trunk, her mother had locked. She said, I never had a key. Mark pried the lid loose, and papers spilled like a confession. Elena unfolded a brittle envelope, marked in her mother's handwriting. She whispered, property of Richard Hale. Mark said, why would she keep his name here? Inside, Elena read words that sliced. Elena, forgive me. He is your father. Silence turned to a roar in her ears. She dropped the page, and Mark caught it before it hit the floor. He said, this changes everything. Tears blurred her sight as she said, my whole life was a secret. He wanted to burn the paper, but instead he held her shoulders and said, you're still you. She shook her head, whispering, I don't know who that is anymore. Downstairs, Elena slammed the letter on the table and said, he lied to me, all of them did. Noah read the page, his jaw tightening. He said, Richard's not just a stranger, he's blood. Mark said, but blood doesn't erase the years you survived without him. Elena paced, clutching her head. She said, she swore she raised me alone. Noah said, maybe she thought she was protecting you. Elena snapped, protection or control? Mark reached out, whispering, don't let him own the truth. She pulled away, tears streaking down. She said, he already owns part of me, and I hate it. The lamp flickered as thunder cracked outside, shaking the windows like punctuation to a cruel sentence. The storm followed Mark into the porch where Richard stood under an umbrella, dry as stone. Richard said, you found it. Mark said, you could have told her yourself. Richard smirked. Would it change how she sees me? Mark said, she sees betrayal. Richard's gaze hardened. I see obligation, he said. Mark said, you're turning her grief into leverage. Richard adjusted his cufflinks, saying, I gave her life, I'll give her future. Mark's fists curled, but he said only, you'll break her. Richard said, she'll thank me when she understands what it costs to succeed. Lightning lit his face, carving angles like knives. Mark whispered, she deserves love, not contracts. Richard's eyes narrowed and he said, we'll see who she chooses. Elena sat on her bed, the scarf pressed against her face when Mark entered. She said, tell me it isn't true. He sat beside her saying, the truth doesn't define you. She whispered, but it defines her. The woman I thought she was. He said, she was still the one who loved you through every storm. Elena sobbed, now he'll use this to control me. Mark said, then don't let him. She looked up, eyes red, saying, you think I'm strong enough? He cupped her hand, whispering, you are stronger than both of us. Her breath steadied, then broke again. She said, If love means letting go, how do I start? He didn't answer, only pulled her into his chest, wishing silence could carry truth more gently than words ever could. The next morning, Richard's card sat on the counter like a loaded gun. Elena said, "If I take his help, I betray her memory." Mark said, "If you don't, you risk losing Seattle." Noah said, "Either way, it costs you." Elena stared at the window, dawn bleeding gold into gray. She said, "I hate choices that feel like chains." Mark whispered, "Then maybe you need to break them." Her shoulders straightened, fragile but fierce. She said, "Seattle is mine, not his." Noah nodded, relief softening his jaw. Mark swallowed, knowing he had built her courage at the expense of his place. She turned to him and said, "Stay with me until I leave." He smiled, thin and trembling, and said, "Always," while his heart rehearsed goodbye. The church smelled of wax and lilies, while rain tapped stained glass. And Elena said, she loved music more than Sundays. Mark stood at the aisle and said, "She loved you more than anything." Pastor Lewis said, "We honor a life woven from grit and grace." Richard sat near the front, motionless as marble. Noah squeezed Mark's shoulder and said, "Breathe." Elena read a memory about burnt pies and second chances, and the room softened. Mark watched her voice steady and thought, "Courage borrows from love." Richard rose to speak and said, "Legacy is responsibility." Mark felt the word land like a gavel. Elena bowed her head and whispered, "Mom, guide me." The choir hummed a low amen, and the sanctuary held its breath for the choice waiting outside. At the graveside, umbrellas bloomed like bruised flowers, and Richard said, "Let me pay and manage your move." Elena stared at the stone and said, "Manage is the problem." Mark said, "She needs space, not strings." Richard said, "Discipline builds futures." Noah said, "Control builds cages." The soil thudded once, heavy and final. Elena whispered, "I can't owe you and still be me." Richard's smile thinned, and he said, "You'll thank me later." Mark stepped closer and said, "She doesn't need your bargain." The wind lifted Elena's scarf like a flag between wars. She said, "I choose Seattle for me, not for you." Richard's eyes hardened, and the moment drew a knife edge between past and flight. Night swallowed the kitchen when Richard returned alone, and he said, "You're the obstacle." Mark leaned on the counter and said, "I'm the person she loves." Richard said, "Love is a distraction she can't afford." Mark felt the word bruise and said, "Love is the reason she'll survive the distance." Richard stepped in, voice soft as ice. He said, "Step aside, and she rises clean." Mark saw the trap gleam like a hook. He said, "She'll rise either way." Richard said, "Not with you slowing her." Mark stared at the letter on the fridge and thought, "This ends with my silence." He said, "Your power ends where her choice begins." Richard's jaw ticked, and he left a cold draft behind him that smelled like victory. In the bedroom's hush, Elena said, "Tell me we outrun this." Mark sat on the edge and said, "You deserve a runway without me being the storm." She shook her head and said, "You're not the storm, you're the lighthouse." He looked at her suitcase half open and said, "Lighthouses stay put so ships can move." She reached for his hand and said, "Don't make me sail alone." He swallowed and said, "If I hold you now, he owns the narrative." She whispered, "Then let's refuse him together." He pressed his forehead to hers and said, "I love you enough to let go." The words cut both of them, clean and ruinous. She said, "Promise me it's for my future, not your fear." He said, "It's for your flight," and the room learned how quiet a heart can break. Dawn bruised the horizon when Mark folded her last sweater and said, "I labeled the boxes by room." Elena traced the ink and said, "You think of everything." He tucked a note into the side pocket and said, "Open it over the ocean." She laughed once and broke. Noah waited in the doorway and said, "Car's ready." Mark lifted the suitcase and felt the weight he would not carry again. Elena said, "If I call, answer." He said, always, and knew always would become silence by design. She pressed her forehead to his chest and said, "Thank you for choosing me over us." He kissed the top of her head and said, "Go make this count." The sun cleared the roofs like mercy, trying to arrive on time. The airport terminal buzzed like a hive, and Elena said, "It feels unreal." Mark carried her bag and said, "Reality is heavier than luggage." Noah said, "Text us when you land." Elena hugged him tightly, whispering, "You've been my anchor." Mark looked at the departure board, each city like a knife. Elena turned to him and said, "I can't do this without your blessing." He said, "You already have it." His voice cracked like glass. She pressed her forehead to his chest and whispered, "Don't disappear." He said, "Disappear if it means you fly." The gate announcement cut through like a blade. She picked up her bag and he thought, letting go is the cruelest kind of love. At the security line, Elena gripped her ticket like it was burning. She said, "I'll call every night." Mark forced a smile and said, "Save your minutes for living." She said, "Don't joke now." He said, "I'm serious. Live it all, every piece." Noah waved from behind, eyes damp. Elena pressed her lips to Mark's cheek and whispered, "I'll never forget you." He said, "Don't remember me, remember yourself." The guard said next, and the moment snapped. Elena walked forward, shoulders trembling but straight. Mark stood frozen, airless, watching her vanish into the tide of travelers. He whispered, "Safe flight, love," though no one heard. The silence after hurt more than any storm. Outside, rain misted the parking lot as Noah unlocked the car. He said, "You don't have to be strong right now." Mark leaned against the door and said, "Strength's the only thing keeping me upright." Noah said, "She'll make it because you let her go." Mark laughed once, bitter, saying, "That's my medal, watching her leave." Noah put a hand on his shoulder and said, "It's proof you loved right." Mark said nothing, staring at the control tower blinking red in the distance. He thought, planes take off while hearts stay grounded. The horn honked behind them, breaking the fragile moment. Noah said, "Let's get home." Mark whispered, "Home doesn't exist without her," but he climbed in anyway. Back in the house, the silence swallowed them. Mark dropped his keys in the bowl. The sound too loud. He said, "Everything looks smaller." Noah set the bags down and said, "It's just emptier." Mark wandered into the living room, staring at her scarf still draped on the chair. He said, "She forgot it." Noah said, "Or she left it for you." Mark picked it up, pressing it to his face. He whispered, "It still smells like her." His chest collapsed under the weight of memory. Noah said, "You gave her a chance she never would have taken alone." Mark said, "Then why does it feel like I lost both of us?" The walls offered no answer, just the echo of goodbye. Later, Mark sat at the porch with coffee gone cold. He said to the night, "I let her go so she could breathe." He pictured her plane carving through clouds, closer to dreams and farther from him. Noah stepped out and said, "You'll heal too." Mark shook his head and said, "Healing feels like betrayal." Noah said, "It feels like survival." Mark looked at the stars, faint behind city haze, and whispered, "If she ever doubts, I hope she remembers this." His voice cracked. Noah said she will. Mark thought, love's truest act is to vanish so another shines. He whispered into the dark, "Good night, Elena," and let silence answer. Morning crept in like a careful guest, as Mark scrolled and found a voice note. Elena said, "I landed. The air smells like rain and coffee." He smiled at the echo of home. She said, "Orientation starts at noon." He whispered, "You've got this." She said, "Don't vanish on me yet." He said, "I'll stay just enough to watch you fly." The message ended with street noise and a laugh that almost healed him. Noah knocked and said, "You okay?" Mark said, "She's there, that's the point." Noah said, "And you are here, still a point." Mark pocketed the phone and breathed like it was a new skill. He said, "Today, I learn how to stay behind." The chimes on the porch answered with a shaky hymn. In a studio with brick walls and a view of cranes, Elena unzipped the suitcase pocket. She found the folded note and traced the creases. She read, "Choose the door that wants your courage." She said, "I hear you." She read, "If you feel alone, that's distance lying." She laughed and cried in the same breath. She said, "You stubborn poet." She read, "When fear gets loud, remember who taught you storms pass." She pressed the paper to her heart and said, "I won't waste this." The kettle clicked off like a small applause. She opened the window and let the cold air sharpen the day. She said, "I'll make it count." The city answered with gulls and promise. Mark walked past the pawn shop and slowed at the neon hum. He said, "Not today," but his feet argued. Inside, the clerk looked up and he said, "I'm just visiting ghosts." The glass case reflected a face he almost knew. He tapped the counter and said, "Do you still have the maple hollow body?" The clerk said, "Sold last night." He swallowed and said, "Good, it deserved hands." He stood in the doorway and listened to a kid in the corner test a cheap acoustic. The chord buzzed, then found itself. Mark said, "Keep going," and the kid grinned. Outside, the wind carried that clumsy music like a benediction. He said, "Some instruments move on." His heart agreed with something like relief. Elena stood outside the clinic, white coat folded over her arm like a vow. She said, "First day," and tied her mother's scarf to her bag. A woman at the bus stop coughed, and Elena stepped over with a bottle of water. The woman said, "You a doctor?" Elena said, "Learning fast." The woman smiled, lines deepening like maps. Elena said, "Take a slow breath with me." They inhaled, exhaled, and the morning steadied. Elena texted, "Walking in," then stopped and deleted the draft. She said, "I can do this." The automatic doors parted like a calm sea. Inside waited fluorescent tests and human storms. She stepped through and felt the city accept her. Dusk painted the porch in bruised violets as Mark set the scarf on the chair back. He said, "You left a lighthouse behind." The sky thinned to a single bright, stubborn star. He whispered, "Be happy even if I'm not there to see it." Noah turned the porch light on and said, "Hungry?" Mark said, "Starving," and surprised himself with the truth. They ate takeout from paper boxes, not a ceremony but enough. He saved one dumpling like a promise and laughed when the cat from next door stole it. He said, "Take what you need." He leaned back and let quiet do the rest. He whispered, "I'd make the same choice, every time." The wind moved the chimes into a soft, grateful song.